Okay, our next speaker this afternoon is the Managing Director of the Office of the Monetary Policy Subsector Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or BSP. He provides highly technical advisory support on matters relating to the formulation, implementation, and assessment of the policies and the organization and programs in his areas of specialization, which include the monetary, external, real, and financial sectors. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, also exercises overall supervision and management of the operations and functions of the monetary policy subsector. Prior to joining the BSP, he had worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Agricultural Credit Policy Council. He also previously taught at the University of the Philippines, and this is in the School of Economics and the De La Salle University in Manila. Our next speaker, Dr. Dakila, received his PhD and his master's degree in economics, and he also received his Bachelor of Science in Economics, magna cum laude, from the University of the Philippines, School of Economics. Dr. Dakila is a lifetime member of the Philippine Statistical Association and the Philippine Economic Society, where he also served as secretary and board member from 2005 to 2008. He is also a member of the International Output or Input-Output Association and currently an associate editor of the Philippine Review of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm round of applause for our next speaker, Dr. Francisco Dakila Jr.
A very pleasant good afternoon to all. And I'd like to thank the Manila Times and the Manila Times CEO and President, Mr. Dante Francis Ang, for this very kind invitation and this opportunity to speak before all of you. We at the BSP also look at this as part of our public information campaign. So we leverage on the organization provided by the Manila Times. And I think it's a very good example of the synergy that can take place between the government and the private sector. Now, as it turns out, there is a very great commonality between the presentations of Dr. Pernia earlier and the presentation that I had prepared. So I'll be glossing over a lot of slides, and in return, I think I can discuss a little bit more on the slides of particular interest to the BSP. So if I may move on, and hopefully I know how to operate this. It's not, okay. Okay, so I think it bears watching to see that the environment where our economy operates is also being shaped by what we can call several global megatrends. And we have them enumerated in this slide. There's an ongoing rebalancing of the world economy. There are changes in demographics worldwide. Some advanced economies are aging, and this has implications on the opportunities for our overseas workers. There is rapid urbanization. There is a challenge from climate change, and it may be very interesting to note that there have been recent conferences on climate change and central banking, two apparently very dissimilar areas. There are disruptive technologies that can impact on the demand for our workers, especially in the BPO sector, and there is a threat of a retreat from multilateralism. So, given this very uncertain global prospects, business as usual stance is no longer an option. Nonetheless, despite the challenging and increasingly uncertain operating environment, we remain optimistic on the prospects of the Philippines. And in this slide, we show you a snapshot of the macroeconomic fundamentals of our country, which have remained solid and robust for 19 years to date. And in the first row, we see the growth performance, as Secretary Pernia had earlier mentioned. This is at the higher rank among the Asian economies. We've had 6.7% growth in 2017. Moreover, with respect to inflation, we had been able to keep within the inflation target band from 2009 up to 2014, which I think is an important achievement. In 2015 and 2016, we were below the band, but that was because of supply-side considerations, not a weakness of demand, but rather oil was very much lower than what we had projected. In 2017, we had been able to keep within the band. That number there says 3.2% inflation. The government target is 3% plus or minus 1 percentage point. And in 2018, I shall tell you later on. We've had ample liquidity and credit, sustained fiscal discipline, sound and stable banking system, and a robust external payments position. Much of this has been discussed by Secretary Pernia earlier, but also this one. But I just want to point out to you what I said earlier, that the Philippines has had uninterrupted expansion for the past 19 years. Actually, even when there was the global financial crisis, when we went down in 2009 to a 1.1% growth, but still we were growing. The Philippines did not contract. Growth had become more broad-based, and as pointed out by Secretary Pernia earlier, a greater proportion of growth is now being accounted for by investments. And we had been able to accelerate growth while at the same time keeping to our inflation targets. That means that our economic engine is now revving up, but it is not overheating. And that is the proof that from 2009 up to 2017, we had not overheated. Okay? Now, in January of 2018, there was an uptick of inflation to 4%, but a large part of that is due to weather-related production disruptions, which pushed up prices of fish and vegetables in many regions. And there were increases in oil prices, but most of the increase is still attributable to the rise in oil worldwide. And to some extent, it is due to the weakness of the currency. But there is probably only, at this point, still minimal impact of the trade. Now, what is our outlook with respect to inflation on 2018 and 2019, where just yesterday, the Monetary Board decided with respect to the monetary policy stance. And the BSP kept the policy interest rate unchanged at 3%. That was a widely anticipated move by the market. No? Many market watchers were looking at what the BSP would do. Well, in consideration of what to do with monetary policy, the board observed that the baseline inflation projection for 2018 is now at 4.3%, which will be a little bit above the upper bound of the inflation target. Okay? So it looks like there is a chance that there may be a breach of the inflation target this year. But starting in 2019, the baseline projection is about 3.5%. So we would be again within the band. And the outlook is that by March of next year, it is by March of next year where inflation will be again decelerating back to within the 2 to 4% band. So there may be a number of months in 2018 when inflation will be fluctuating either a little bit above target or within target. But the main thing to note is that any inflationary developments as of this point emanates really purely from the supply side, and therefore is essentially self-limiting and transitory. And that was the main reason behind the decision of the board. And moreover, as shown in the forecasts for inflation on the lower left panel of this chart, they do fall within the band. This is for several international observers, including the baseline of the IMF. But I think the IMF baseline here still does not take into account the impact of the train. And Yong Zeng may be presenting a different baseline later on. I'll await that. I'll await the numbers. But on the upper right panel, we see that the average inflation projection in the private sector economists being surveyed by the BSP is at 3.6% for 2018 and at 3.5% for 2019. So this is still within target, and this is the survey done as of January. Liquidity has been quite adequate, with the credit growth growing at 19% for end 2017, and the liquidity itself, M3, grew by 11.9%. And moreover, the BSP noted that the lending continues to flow into the country's production sectors, with more than 1/5 of total bank loans going to wholesale and retail trade. Other destinations of bank loans were motor repair, transportation and storage, and the information and communication sectors. And in the next slide, I want to emphasize the message that we get from the left panel. There we see the trend in non-performing loans of universal commercial banks, from double-digit levels as recently as 2004, we're now down to below 2%. Actually, at 1.2% as of end 2017. And we can see the clear downward trajectory here, showing that the loan portfolio of the banking system is becoming healthier. And on the right panel, we look at the capital adequacy ratio of commercial banks. The international norm is at 8%, which is the lower dashed line there. And the norm set by the BSP is at 10%. And the actual adequacy ratios of banks are way above both the Philippine and international norms. Our reserves stand at about a little higher than $81 billion. What's more important is how big those reserves are in comparison to the size of the economy. And if we look at it, compare the Philippines to other economies in the region, we're actually on the high side. Our import cover is at 8.2 times. That means our reserves can cover about 8.2 months worth of imports. The international norm is just 3 times. So we're significantly more comfortable than the international norm. On the lower right panel, we show the trend with respect to external debt. And relative to the size of the economy, the external debt number is also showing a significant downward trend. That is shown by the red line on the lower right panel. Of course, this performance is backed up by a long track record of structural reform, which has taken place through various administrations. And I think this is something that foreign investors look at, that the commitment to reforms and the impetus to reforms has been maintained through the various political administrations. And of course, with respect to the BSP, the commitment is to conduct monetary policy appropriately, maintain the appropriate stance of monetary policy, continues to strengthen the resilience to external shocks, and to initiate key financial sector reforms. Now, this slide pertains to the real economy, but I think it's a quite important slide that I want to spend some time on this because it's not so widely, the information is not so widely disseminated. We see that the Philippines has been accelerating its economic performance. An important question is that something that is cyclical, or is there a structural story behind that? Is that something that is sustainable? Now, I want to turn to the upper right panel of this slide, which shows, Secretary Pernia alluded to this a little while ago. These are our measures of so-called total factor productivity. And what is total factor productivity? It is the contribution of technological improvement to growth. It is the portion of growth that is attributable to better technology. And what we see is that from essentially zero TFP for the period 1989 to 1992, that is the first bar in that chart, our TFP average has gone up. This is the last bar, is for the period 2010 to 2017. Our TFP has gone up to 2.1 percentage point. That means when you see the growth number, 6.7%, about 2 percentage points of that is now being contributed by technological improvement. Now, next, I want to turn our attention to the upper left panel of this chart, which is the incremental capital output ratio. Now, what is the meaning of the so-called incremental capital output ratio, or the I-COR? It is the additional capital needed in order to produce an additional peso of output. That's why it's capital over output. And therefore, the lower that ratio is, the greater the efficiency of capital, because you need less capital to produce the same amount of output. And what do we see? Within that same period of time, the I-COR has declined from 9.5 to 3.7. That is almost a 2/3 decline, more than half a decline in the I-COR. Now, all of these measures are subject to a lot of statistical uncertainty, because you're dealing with unobservable numbers. A lot of errors come into the statistical computation. But when you have trends as pronounced as this, then even allowing for the statistical error, the conclusions are robust. Now, again, and often we hear that, why is employment not growing as fast as what we would like employment numbers to be? Well, I think it also bears looking at the quality of employment. So I want to direct our attention to the lower left panel of this slide, which shows us employment share by class of workers. Now, the way employment is defined, and we're actually at par with international norms with respect to the definition, no? But if you are working, say for example, in a sari-sari store of your sister, you're considered employed. But you're in the special class of so-called unpaid family workers. What the lower left panel shows is that, look at the green portion. That green portion is unpaid worker. That has been diminishing slowly through time, and from 2006 to 2017, the share of wage and salary workers has increased from 51.1% of the total to 62.5% of the total. So again, there is a structural change taking place in the labor sector towards more formal sector employment with wages. And now on the lower right panel, we look at employment by educational attainment and look at the green portion is this high school. At least high school educated has been increasing, but the share now of only those with elementary education has been falling. So, with respect to all the three major factors of production, I enumerated them: technology, capital, and labor. The message is that there is a structural change that is taking place in the Philippines. And I think it's an argument for saying that there is a lot to say to support the argument now that the level of potential capacity of the Philippines has improved. And actually, our own estimates at the BSP show that potential output growth of the economy now ranges from between 6 to 7%. And that is much higher than the historical average of about 4.5% growth of the economy. What does potential capacity mean, the growth of potential capacity? It is the rate of growth that is possible without overeating. Now, when the government infrastructure program comes in, our simulations indicate that it is possible to grow at close to the upper bound of the government growth targets. That's at around 7. The target now for 2018 up to 2022 is from 7 to 8% growth. So, of course, we should be mindful of the downside risks to growth, which can come from both the external and domestic sectors. That's something that we always watch out for. But we are optimistic, as well as international observers, that growth can be sustained. Actually, here we present the projections of the IMF and the World Bank. I hope they will not contradict me later on when you present your projections later. So it's on the upbeat. And in my final slide, I present the outlook for the Philippines for 2018. We expect, the target for inflation is from 2 to 4, but the baseline projection now is at 4.3. But very importantly, 2019, we're back to within the target band. We're hoping to see a recovery in our exports, with exports growing at 9%, and imports also recovery at 10%. For the balance of payments, we are still projecting a deficit as of this year. And likewise, as a deficit in the current account, but small relative to the size of the gross domestic product of the Philippines. Now, just a word about the current account, because that is something that is often seen in the business pages and in some observers expressing some concern about the narrowing of the current account. The narrowing of the current account was actually one of those cited for the weakness of the peso. But I think it's very important to look at it in another way, because when you look at the current account in terms of the macroeconomic identity, the current account is equal to the excess of savings over investment. And the narrowing of the current account can happen either because of two things. Savings can be falling, so you're narrowing because your saving investment gap is getting smaller, but saving is now getting closer to investment, and that's the bad kind. Or the current account can be narrowing because the investment rate is rising and it is getting closer to the saving rate. And that's a good kind of narrowing of the current account, because it is actually building on the productive capacity of the economy. And when you look at what has driven our imports, a very big component of that is due to capital goods imports, also imports of raw materials. And the picture is very consistent, because when you have a very strong domestic component of the economy, you do need raw materials in order to produce. And that will cause your imports to rise and your current account to narrow. But it is not the development that should cause us to worry. So with that, I end my presentation, and just I think this presentation is available to all. So I end with the key takeaways for the Philippine economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Dakila.